जिंदाबाद अपनी MSO जिंदाबाद जिंदाबाद जिंदाबाद।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम और शुक्रिया। फॉर्मल जो बात कहनी है वो मैं इंग्लिश में ही कहूँगा क्योंकि उस लैंग्वेज में मैं सबसे ज़्यादा कंफर्टेबल हूँ। पर बाद में जो सवालात हैं, क्वेश्चंस हो, वो आप मुझसे उर्दू या हिंदी या बांग्ला में पूछ सकते हैं। तीनों लैंग्वेज में मैं कंफर्टेबल हूँ। पर टॉक जो है और जो समझ में ना आए, कुछ अगर लैंग्वेज डिफ़िकल्ट लगे तो बाद में आप पूछ सकते हैं। कोशिश करूँगा कि मैं बहुत ज़्यादा जल्दी ना बोलूँ और कोई भी पॉइंट हो तो उसको मैं धीरे धीरे एक्सप्लेन करूँ ताकि आप समझ पाएँ कि मैं क्या बोलने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ। और स्क्रीन शेयर ज़रा अवेलेबल कर दीजिए। कुछ लार्जर पॉइंट्स ऐसे हैं कि मैंने उसको पावर पॉइंट्स में अवेलेबल कर दिया ताकि इधर उधर टॉक जो है भागे नहीं। कोशिश रहेगी कि टू द पॉइंट हम स्टिक करें और जो मेन मुद्दा है उस पर टिके रहें। जो प्रोसेस है, किस लाइन पे बात कर रहे हैं, उस पे टिके रहें। So what I'll be talking about essentially today is the origins and the contradictions of secularism. I'll touch upon India towards the end. What I want to lay out is how the very idea of secularism came into being and how it has sort of morphed into what it is today, how it stands today, how it has changed and transformed, how it's in contradiction and how it's transforming constantly, how it's in a process of becoming rather than simply being. When I use the term becoming, what I intend to convey is the fact that secularism, or the very idea of secularism, is not something that is stationary. It's not something that is given to us. It is always contested. It's always being made. It's always in transformation. So let's begin with the idea and the geography of secularism. What is its origin? How did it come into being? So when we think about secularism, the first question that comes to our mind is, what is this idea of secularism? What is secularism? So when we think about secularism and sort of raise this question as to what is secularism, it's the Western idea that comes to our mind first, because it seems like a Western idea, at least. It seems like a European idea. So the first idea that comes to our mind when we think about secularism is that it connotes the separation of church and state. It means that religion, church over here meaning religion, has its own place, and state or statecraft or government or governance has its own place, and they should not mix with one another. There should be complete separation. That is what secularism in the West essentially means. That is the classical notion of what secularism stands for. And that is what classical ideas of, like if someone was teaching you about secularism, that is what they would essentially tell you. So the next question that comes to our mind, or the next question that one would ask is, how could Europe become secular when others are still sort of struggling with the idea of secularism? So when we start thinking about, for example, Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, any of the Islamic countries of the world, or even for that matter, India or Pakistan, the question that arises is that, what is so unique about Europe? Are they more enlightened human beings? Has Christianity got something? Can you all hear me? Is Christianity more liberal, open, more accepting, that makes it secular in its imagination, whereas other religions are more closed, that makes it less secular? Is there something exceptional about Europe which makes Europe secular, whereas other parts of the world are not that exceptional, which makes it not so secular? So those are some of the questions that come to our mind when thinking about secularism. That is how it's presented in many parts of the world. That is how Europe wants to present to the world when talking about secularism. That is what you will see in many magazines, whether you're reading the Hindustan Times or Outlook. That is the kind of rhetoric or even the liberal notion of secularism that you would come across while thinking about secularism. But, these are sort of pop versions of secularism. A deeper intellectual engagement and a critical engagement with the idea of secularism and questioning these very notions of secularism will take you in a different direction. And really engaging with the history of secularism would sort of take you to the question of, why did Europe need secularism, rather than how could Europe become secular? Because the reality is that Europe went through something called the Dark Ages. If you start looking at Europe through the 9th century or the 10th century or the 11th century or even the 7th century, you would realize that Europe was a place where it was very difficult to do science and history and study human beings, because Europe was colonized by the papacy, meaning the center of Christianity was Rome. The papacy was located in Rome, and either Rome ruled Europe directly or indirectly. So essentially, Europe, it is problematic to think of Europe as Christian Europe. But Europe was colonized by Christianity, by the papacy, or directly or indirectly, or by Rome. And under the unified Christian Catholic Church, it was very difficult to do science. Whatever you did, whether you were studying human beings, or you were studying social sciences, or you were studying the galaxy, or you were studying mathematics, whatever you studied, whatever you did, you could only do within the confines and realms of what the papacy or the priests would allow you to do. Whatever the priestly class considered non-heretic. If the priestly class considered something to be heretic, meaning a sin, then you could be burnt on the stake, meaning you could be burnt alive. You could be simply told that you are a sinner, and that means you have committed sin, you have to be burnt alive. So Europe was a very problematic region because of the power of the church, Christian church. And the church had become extremely corrupt. By the time, so basically Europe had, it is not because Europe was exceptional. In fact, Europe was very, very problematic. Europe was relatively backward. While Europe was really backward, the Arab region, whether it was Baghdad or Iran or much of Arabia or North Africa, were far more liberal places comparatively. China was pretty advanced, and so were South Asia. People were trying to study mathematics. There was trade relations. They were far, comparatively, compared to Europe, these were far more open societies. And the nature of relationship between the ruling elites and the priestly class was not so claustrophobic as was the case in Europe. And then we see the arrival of the Arabs into Europe. The Arabs and the North African started colonizing Europe. It's very problematic to say that Muslims colonized Christian Europe. As I keep on saying, the epicenter was Roman Catholic that colonized whole of Europe. So now you have new colonizers colonizing other parts of Europe. New colonizers were Arabs and North Africans who were going into Europe. So there were substantial sections of the European population which were also becoming Muslim. So half of Greece and many parts of Spain had become Muslims. And there is evidence of coexistence of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. They were living together at that point of time. But, by the time of the Muslims were sort of pushed out by 1224 from Sicily. By 1492, they were pushed out of the Iberian Peninsula. So by the 15th century, late 15th century, they were more or less out of Europe. Up till that time, European Christianity was still in the Dark Ages, but Europe had started interacting with the Arabs, and the Arabs were very much into philosophy. And they are the ones who had translated the works of Aristotle and Plato and the early Greek philosophers, and were engaged in quite a bit of debates about the presence or absence of God, very high theory and liberal thinking. And that had influenced some bit of European thought. So one of the key debates that is of tremendous importance that transformed Europe and created the grounds for secularism was the debate between Ibn Rushd and Ghazali. And both Ibn Rushd and Ghazali sort of agreed on certain key principles of there being God, and of there being truth, and what is there in the Quran being true. But there were certain differences. Both agreed that there were things that meant for common people to understand, and then there were high philosophy which not everyone could understand. What Ghazali felt was, Imam Ghazali felt, was that enlightenment could be achieved by some based on transcendence, based on some could be enlightened because it came as God's gift, whereas Ibn Rushd believed that it could be enlightenment is achieved based on science and rationality. And that was the key aspect. That's the key difference between these two ideas. And Ibn Rushd then became sort of the leading foundational members of European thought, along with Aristotle, in how European ideas, so-called European ideas of enlightenment progressed. So by the late 15th century, the Arabs and the North Africans had been pushed out of Europe, But Ibn Rushd's idea remained really important. Here you see the statue of Ibn Rushd in Spain. He's still celebrated as a key foundational member of Enlightenment.